Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you coming out here in Newton today to join us for one of our seminars. We're very excited about the presentation today. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce Bill Maclay, Maclay Architects, all the way down from way down up in Vermont. Thank you for coming down. We had the pleasure of working with Bill and his team on the Drumlin Farm project out in Lincoln, the Environmental Learning Center that was completed in May. A great project that was actually designed to achieve net positive results. So a lot of what you're hearing today, we implemented just down the street in Lincoln. Bill has been pioneering net zero design and construction techniques for more than 4 decades. He brings a wealth of knowledge to this subject. When we started working with Bill, I think almost 2 years ago now, we figured the first thing we could do was to read his book. He's the author of the new Net Zero here. Figured it was a smart thing to do and get on board with this team. So we bought the book, cycled it through the project team, and it was a great foundation for us moving forward on the project. We learned a ton from it. But ultimately, his invaluable contributions throughout the project helped us to deliver a fantastic project for Mass Audubon. And left us all a little bit smarter at the end of the project. In addition to his writing and his architecture practice, Bill is a tireless advocate for low energy buildings. He's often on the circuit doing these kinds of talks. So when I asked him if he'd be willing to participate in our seminar series, he jumped at the chance. And I thank you for that, to spread the word a little bit and give you some details on how to actually achieve these kinds of results in the real world environment. So. Thank you very much, Bill, and please join me in welcoming Bill Maclay.
Thank you very much. It's totally a pleasure to be here. As Ben mentioned, we had a really great time working with all of Chapman's crew and their subs on the ambitious project at Mass Audubon that we worked on. And I think for me, it typifies how design and construction really needs to come together, work together, and it was really a great relationship doing stuff that not that many people have done, and doing it successfully with minimum amounts of headaches and challenges. So if I could get a little bit of information about who's here. How many people are mostly in construction trades, building? And how many from design profession, architects, engineers, and other? What's a couple of the others?
City planning.
Great. One other one?
Door manufacturer.
Great. And then the only other question I have is, most people here have been involved in environmental, sort of high environmental performing buildings to some degree. Is that true? So hopefully I'll speak at a reasonable level for everybody who's here. My goal is that you'll know everything there is to know about net zero by in another hour. It's a topic that obviously I'm pretty enthused about. Sort of some of the questions we get is net zero too expensive? You know, or people say, gee, I'd love to do net zero, but I just can't afford net zero. And is net zero too difficult technologically? Is it really a challenge to do? And many people think if you're going to do a high energy performing building, my time goes back to the Jimmy Carter days when everybody thought that environmental buildings were ugly. Does that mean that a net zero building needs to be ugly? The question I guess I left off here is that probably 3/4 of Americans actually don't even want to know what is net zero. Is that what kind of weird thing is that? So this is the learning objectives. Basically the learning objectives from my perspective are simple. Net zero technology works. It supports productive and healthy buildings. It's the best financial investment. And people really are enthusiastic and eager to be in net zero buildings. It's a major plus, and those of us who do it, I think it can be a help to our businesses and obviously better for the planet as well. Our firm is about relationships and collaboration. The first thing for us is how do you work with other people? If we can't work well, we're not going to be delivering great results, and we're not going to be able to accomplish the innovation that I think is important. The other thing is we are building buildings, but for us, buildings aren't just bricks and mortar. They're experiences to how people live their lives. Making buildings that are healthy and beautiful for us is also incredibly important, although this talk is focused on the net zero and energy side of things. And last of all, we really want to focus on how do we create value in the work we do, both in terms of how buildings are used, but also long-term value and even short-term value, like positive cash flow from day one. Our firm started with its first solar building back in the 1970s. Reagan came in and that sort of slowed down a little bit. I focused on energy conservation, building science, healthy buildings, and for the last 10 years, the focus of our firm has been pretty much entirely on net zero buildings, net zero ready buildings, very high performing buildings. Out of doing that, we felt it was important to share the knowledge that we had, showing people how net zero really is achievable and affordable, and can be done with both small buildings and big buildings. Just to give my plug, if anyone wants a copy of the book, I will sell copies of the book at the end of, at a discount from the fairly high price that it normally is. So I'm not going to talk about all of the environmental disaster. I think everybody here knows the challenges that we're in. I think what I want to do is focus on the solutions. You know, and often we as people in the design and construction profession think that it's about, you know, we'll find the new technology. Actually, what I found is that it really is about thinking. I think that Einstein's quote in terms of, you know, if we think the same way we did that created the environmental crisis, we're probably not going to actually come up with the environmental solutions we need. We need to start looking at thinking in a different way than we have previously. So first, from my perspective, we're at a point in the history of the planet that is incredibly remarkable. It's the transformation to renewable energy. You know, we think about it, and I wrote, you know, the title of the book says the new net zero, like, you know, I or others invented net zero. You know, the fact is that net zero is how human civilization has existed throughout 99.9% of its evolution. It's really only in the last 100 years that we've started using fossil fuels. So we need to start thinking of fossil fuels as an aberration, not the sort of standard practice that I think most of us think that it is. When we look towards the future, I think, you know, what we're going to see is that we are, in my opinion, we've actually met the tipping point of where we really are headed in the renewable era. And the way that that will happen is through huge amounts of energy conservation and then the addition of renewables. So, you know, many people think, well, gee, you know, these renewable things can't really power the planet. We got too much, the loads are way too big. I'm not going to go into the details, but I mean, one just is that when you look at utilities and what they're building these days, they're building renewables. They aren't building gas, they aren't building coal, they aren't building oil. I mean, even the utilities are realizing this actually is already, today, the cheapest form of energy, not to mention that it's obviously the best form of energy. So what does this really look like? I think probably most people here know that buildings are about 50% of the energy that we consume. So if we make our buildings net zero, we actually have solved at least 50% of a pretty significant problem. So when I talk about net zero, what do I mean by net zero? There's all kinds of definitions from NREL, from International Living Futures, New Buildings Institute. Our book, we have a definition which is a building, a community, a country, or preferably a planet that produces as much energy as it consumes on an annual basis using only renewable energy. So, you know, much of the net zero sort of harks back to the 70s when we were all going to do these energy independent buildings and that's how we were going to solve the world. I think net zero isn't just doing net zero buildings, it's actually looking at it as communities, community solar systems, utility scale. It's a much bigger deal than that. So the net zero strategy is really pretty simple. You minimize the loads of heating and cooling and refrigeration and plug loads. Then you add renewable energy, and that should be either zero or positive. In fact, I mean, for a net zero building, actually all of them are net positive if they really are net zero, at least to some degree. Another term that I will use is net zero ready. That means basically all the energy conservation loads were done. It's all ready for the renewables, so you can just plug the renewables in, but the renewables weren't able to be afforded at that time, so that it's still non-renewables powering it, but with a plan to switch over to renewables. And so that's what we call net zero ready. So, we've used a lot of net zero, so is this net zero? An all glass building? I'm pretty sure that with that amount of PV, it'll, be net zero. In fact, I think probably a lot less than that. But it brings up the question of what creates a balance of energy conservation and renewable energy. How do we actually figure out what that ought to be? So I think pretty much everybody in this room would know approximately the fuel mileage of the car that they drive. And my guess is that maybe there's a few people starting to realize, what the sort of fuel mileage of their buildings are, but most of us don't really know how efficient the buildings that they're in. So, do we want Hummers or do we want Priuses or something even better than Priuses? When we look at buildings, you can look at this glass house or you can look at something that's a mixture of glass and energy conservation. And the fuel mileage for buildings in the jargon that we use is basically trying to come up with how much energy is consumed per square foot of a building. That way you can compare one building to another building. And the jargon that is used is EUI, or energy use intensity. But really it's just saying how much is consumed on a per square foot, and then you can compare one building to another and say this is good or this is not so good. So these are all sort of arbitrary numbers. They're thousands of BTUs energy consumed per square foot per year. So that's sort of the measure that we end up using. And typical existing buildings might be 60 to 120,000 kBTUs per square foot per year. Code compliant knocks that down some. High performance, what we call high performance, is a little better than that. The net zero ready is down, less than 30 and down to around 15 kBTU. So it's like 10 to 20% of what typical existing buildings are. Pretty drastic lowering. And then if the solar gets added, it becomes net zero or net positive. So we've been talking about energy consumed per square foot. That's one way of evaluating it. For those of us who prefer our values, we can look at the prescriptive metrics, and the roof is typically R60 for most typical buildings, R5 windows, which means triple glazed windows, above grade walls of R40, slab and below grade walls of R20, and an air infiltration of 0.05 CF cubic feet per minute per square foot measured at 50 pascals. That is basically, for those of you who have heard of Passive House, the very rigorous European standard, that's the standard that we go by also for net zero buildings. And all of these metrics actually are pretty much what Passive House standards are. They're actually standards that we've been using going back before Passive House, but they are basically the same. So if we look at a net zero building, first we're looking at energy conservation. Then we're looking at high efficient mechanical systems. That's typically air source or ground source heat pumps. And then we're powering it with renewables. It's a really pretty simple overall formula. So today, this is already the best investment. Net zero buildings or net zero ready buildings, from our experience, cost about $5 to $20 a square foot more. So yes, there is a premium. That comes out to like 3 to 10% cost increase in construction. Solar these days, particularly in Massachusetts, is relatively easily financed. And so when you look at these, the envelope can be cash flow positive if you finance that. The heat pumps can be cash flow positive if you finance that. And the renewables can be cash flow positive. So all of those pieces, in fact, can be cash flow positive. So here I'm going to go into money because I did my first solar building in 1973. I can tell you that financially it was probably one of the dumbest investments that was possible to make at that point in time. I'm glad that I did it. We all needed to do that to experiment and move things forward. But financially it didn't make a whole lot of sense. And many of us, myself included, have said, well, environmentally, we gotta make these great environmental buildings, and have ignored the financial part. So for the last 5 years in my practice, we actually have really focused on the financial piece because, what we found is most people, given the choice, would rather do an environmental building. Most people don't want to be doing a fossil fuel building. But they do have a legitimate concern about is this going to cost too much? And is this going to be something that I can't really afford? So we've looked at that and said, this is important. So let's take a single family home. We said, okay, we're going to go to a modular housing company, ask them to tell us the price for a code compliant house that I could buy that day, 1,600 square feet, and tell us also a net zero house and what would that cost. So the net zero added $16 of additional construction cost to the house. If you took the solar costs and allocated to the square footage, that was another $14. So $30 a square foot more, so it's significant for the net zero. When we look at the costs, we start off with the additional solar costs, the additional building construction costs. Then we add interest on top of that, because that money extra money, if you finance it, you're going to actually pay interest on that. So it looks like we're not doing so well until we look at the energy costs of the code compliant house, and this is over a 30-year lifetime. That turns out to be a $60,000 savings. With tax credits at the time, that comes out to $72,000. So what does this mean? I mean, what this means is that you can do a net zero home, and over 30 years, you're going to save $72,000, and what you're going to find is that it actually is cash flow positive from day one. When you add the energy costs and the mortgage costs, from day one, that homeowner is going to actually pay less money. So now when homeowners come in and say to us, gee, I can't afford to do a net zero home, we say, actually, you can't afford not to do a net zero home. It, in fact, is going to be cheaper for you. There are other challenges around financing and other things, but those are doable. And once you've paid off your mortgage, the PV, and paid off the PV, you actually will get basically free solar for a number of years after that. So that's great. You know, single family homes, we can make them net zero, but is that really going to, save the planet? So is it possible to do this on large buildings? And I think that's been a concern for quite a while. So this is a courthouse and a state office building. This is for the state of Vermont. No interest in getting anything above what the code requirements were for the building. No interest in net zero ready. And it's 65,000 square feet. And this is a renovation and a major addition. It ended up being LEED Gold. The additional incremental cost was $6 a square foot to go from code compliant to net zero ready in this case, a 3% net zero cost increase. Since then, they actually have added, through power purchase agreement, solar to the project as well. Here's the interesting thing. For the state of Vermont and the taxpayers of Vermont, $750,000 savings over 20 years. So we can take large buildings, $750,000. I mean, that's reasonable amount of money. This is this actually is cost effective. Again, when that's looked at on a cash flow basis from day one, it's going to lower taxes for the residents of Vermont. So this is, and it's got a good return on investment and continued savings over time. Here in Massachusetts, we worked some with the Lincoln School with a local architecture firm, SMMA, in Cambridge, looking at addition and renovation for a $90 million plus project. These are graphs on the left. We looked at a bunch of different, so from the far left is code, then there was code plus, then there was net zero ready. And what happened there was they had very cheap gas and very expensive electricity. Well, the heat pumps are using electricity. So that's why when you look at this, the code actually looks pretty good. Code plus gets worse. And net zero ready is not a very good option. So we said, ooh, this isn't so good. But Massachusetts actually has very good solar programs. And so if the town gets involved in the solar side of it as well as the other side, it will actually lower the taxes for people in Lincoln. That was a big help in terms of selling the school because the environmental community obviously was enthusiastic about it being a very high-performing building. And the people who are concerned about budgets also were in favor of it, who normally would say, gee, this is too expensive. We can't afford this fancy environmental building. So if this is such a great deal, why isn't this happening? I think one of the reasons it's not happening is the way that I and many others sold energy conservation in the past, which is on paybacks. 10-year payback, you know, gee, if I put money in that, it's going to take me 10 years to get it back. It's not worth it. You know, I don't want to wait around that long. But if you're financing it, then your cash flow can be positive from day one. So we have totally shifted in terms of how do we talk about energy to a cash flow basis. And that's, you know, to me, it ultimately makes the most sense. So we've been focused on the energy savings, particularly in terms of the building and operation part, but you need to look at net zero buildings throughout the whole flow of design. Getting permits. Very often, if you do a net zero project and you've got a major project, you actually can save months or even years of permitting. Because the environmental community who may be against the project may actually say, oh, this actually is doing something that's unique and contributing to the project. I mean, it's not a guarantee, but it can be effective there. It actually also can increase the resale value. There's beginning to be metrics that are being done in terms of resale value of net zero buildings where the energy costs are actually low. It actually increases the value of the building. So there are other places to look for it, the enhancement. Also, there's a sort of 10-100 rule around, if you look at the rent of a building and it was $3 a square foot for the energy improvements, the mortgage and rent is like 10 times that, and salaries are 100 times what the energy is. So a lot of people have now been focused on, if people are more productive in these net zero buildings with good indoor air quality and health, there's the potential for 100 times savings. And there actually is a fair amount of documentation about that. This just shows in a pie chart how salaries and benefits, if you look at the time period of a building being used, that you're spending most of it on salaries and benefits. The energy, the design, and all those costs are actually peanuts in the overall scheme of buildings. So in terms of environmental benefits, if you have a window and you're looking outdoors, improved mental memory and mental memory functions has been documented. Call processing is quicker. I think one of the remarkable things, they have documented that if you are in a hospital in a room with a window, you actually will leave the hospital sooner than if you're one without it. And hopefully if it has a tree or some green out there, nature makes a big difference in terms of happiness, productivity, job satisfaction, all of those things. Daylight, documented proof that daylight classrooms actually increase learning ability and test scores. Workers are more productive, and these are documented studies. In retail sales, actually Walmart documented over double-digit increase in sales in a daylit Walmart versus one that was not daylit. So there are other benefits not as easy to document, but ultimately with a lot better payback even than just the energy piece. And obviously better lighting, better ventilation, temperature control, those all also have productivity increases. So, you know, we've been thinking about buildings and what that means. Well, let's say we made a net zero planet. What does that mean? Well, if we took all of the costs around fossil fuels and we added those up, the things that are happening, and then we compared that to net zero implementation costs on a cash flow basis again, you'd actually discover that it's much cheaper today to go to the net zero implementation than it is on the fossil fuel. Rocky Mountain Institute actually has started doing some numbers and calculations and estimates in terms of that. So, you know, how do we do net zero? I'm going to show some examples. This is our office in Waitsfield, Vermont. We're actually in the barn building. We have an apartment next door. This is barn and the apartment are both net zero historic buildings, maintaining the historic character. And we, on the inside, it had been altered, so we actually insulated on the inside, left the outside exactly the way it was. This is for our office, a 17 kW solar PV system. This shows our office is up in Waitsfield. My house is down in Warren, where I live, my home. And we ended up with a community solar system for the apartments and also actually part of our house. And at our house, we actually produce some energy. We have these tracking collectors, which actually we lease, and it goes to a fire department nearby. So this, I think, is an example of how we can start to integrate solar through net metering on larger aggregates. Project, our first sort of major net zero project over almost 10 years ago. It's been net zero for 10 years. Its EUI is actually one of the lowest anywhere in the country that's documented. It's 9, which is very low. It also was LEED platinum. It sort of has standard, it has air source heat pumps, a lot of energy conservation. It actually is in a north-facing hillside because that's what made sense on the campus and locating at the heart of the campus. But it does have passive solar. And the wall assembly, it's a steel building, but it's code-wise a wood frame building, which meant that we can get much better insulated envelope to the building because it's a wood frame. It's much easier to do than with steel. Just the inside, so you see the daylighting and views. Our goal is to have beautiful buildings. This is a meditation and yoga studio. So they did that building. They had this is a Putney School. They had then over 40 buildings, which were old, historic, and energy hogs. So they said, gee, this is great. We got one building that's net zero, but our whole campus isn't really so good. So we worked with them. We looked at every building on the campus, and we said, what would it cost to actually, if we did all of this today, what would it cost to take it to net zero? And so we calculated that, which for the campus was $20 million. But they have now been incrementally working towards that. This is sort of the analysis we did in terms of this is the energy EUI for all of the buildings on campus. This is the building that we had designed. You can see that's pretty different than, one of those is the kitchen. Between the red lines is where it should be for net zero. So you can see there's not a whole lot of that on the campus. And so we then, building by building, with a contractor, figured out what would it cost to make each building net zero ready. They've put in a 500 kW system. They need to put in about another 500 kW system eventually, but they've started doing that campus-wide. This is an existing dorm that we worked with them to make net zero, an old, really energy hog project, but we turned it around to net zero. So this was a project that goes back to, I think, around 2006 or something like that. 65,000 or 70, actually I think it's 77,000 square feet. Office and manufacturing. People said you can't really make these big buildings renewably powered. This one does actually use wood pellets, so it's what we call carbon neutral. And this project's been in operation for quite a while now. You can see an EUI of 18 and 17. They're really, really excellent EUIs, a steel building. It does sort of the classic solar buildings. It's built into a south-facing hillside. Has passive ventilation strategies. All the offices are on the south side. The warehouse is on the north side, bermed into the hillside. The lower floor is just a smaller floor with offices, and upstairs is electronics and engineering and the warehouse space. That's phase one, and there's also a phase two. This is a steel building. We work to make a steel frame on the inside, and then all of the insulation is outside of that steel frame, so there's not pieces of steel that are going through from the inside to the outside, which in steel buildings are a humongous problem. Also, steel buildings often have issues where the wall hits the roof. There's actually a lot of deflection and movement, and then air gaps move in there, so we actually design that so that the steel is stiffer, normal with what's there. We calculate how much deflection will be, and we put like a foam gasket in there so that it actually is well sealed. They wanted it a warm and wonderful place for people to work, which I think is as important as the energy conservation. So it actually has a fireplace. It has a dining and a space that people can informally meet, and the whole company can meet there as well. This is going back into the office area. So on the right is our offices. Walking, going by it, plants there. You can see a little bit of the upper windows, which have blinds which guide the light up to the ceiling and bounce the light deeper into the space so that natural light works better. This is in the warehouse space that has a lot of windows and natural light and skylights in it. The second phase, it was a wind energy monitoring company, so that's the wind goddess. So they integrated art into the project as well. So the light brown is the 77,000 square feet of the building. They looked at their land and said, gee, we got 50 acres. What about if we made a whole net zero 300,000 square feet of office, manufacturing, and residential? Could that work financially? We actually got the efficiency utility in Vermont to fund a study looking at different building types, office manufacturing, and single and multifamily residential and affordable housing, and said, could this whole project be cash flow positive and net zero? So this is looking at the commercial part, and if you look at that part, you'll see over on the right that it does go down and actually reduces the cost. Actually, that part was if you aggregated all the residential together, it shows a very clear benefit to the net zero. The commercial, not quite as clear a picture because commercial lending rates lending is typically on shorter time periods, but there are ways to actually lower that down, and even in that case, it's basically at the same level. It's not actually a loss. It's cash flow neutral. In Maine, we did a project for Coastal Maine Botanical Gardens, an education and office space, an EUI of 19. This is certified as a net zero building and net positive building, and that was in 2011. On the right-hand side is education space. It could be one big space or 3 classrooms. And on the left is office space. This is a wood frame building. So again, heavily insulated wall and roof and assemblies. This, they had to have, their busy season is the summertime. So being shut down in the summer was critical. So we actually used a panelized system, Benson wood. We worked with them in terms of the panels so that it could be erected during the winter faster, which worked out very well. And this is just how it sits into the landscape, overlooking gardens. This is in Lincoln, the project that we worked with Chapman on, Mass Audubon. Environmental performance was very important for them, and also budget was very important to them. And so this is actually a very simple rectangular box to make it so that it's as cost effective as possible. But this is a section through it. We worked with Chapman on wood beams that actually go through and are exposed. This is showing the ceiling, which as you come in, you come across a bridge, across a rain garden. You come into the entrance of the low ceiling with slats on the ceiling, and those curve around to soften the building. And then you look out at windows over nature at the far side. So when you enter, you actually look right through. You look through the building. This is a plan. So there's what they call the great room. The people who are the educators work in here, and then the classrooms are out actually in the landscape. But they come in and organize, and this room, can have dozens of students or dozens of the teachers working in here, and then there's the core people in open and closed offices. Basically what we did was put in the center of the building bathroom, mechanical space, and a meeting room, the places that don't need as much daylight, kept open offices so that there was as much light and view for everybody as possible, and put the offices around the side of the building. One of the things in terms of net zero buildings is not only do you need a lot of insulation to cut down on heat loss, the layers that you have, we talked some about the blower door testing. So there's an air infiltration layer, which in this case is the red color. And this is actually Chapman very nicely took our drawings and showed in color where the different layers were so that it's very, very clear. But the important thing is that that layer goes all the way around the building, and it's absolutely continuous with no holes whatsoever in it. And similarly, the water, so that moisture and drainage plane works, that also needs to be continuous, or so that there's no water that's obviously getting in the building. Water vapor also needs to be controlled. All of those things need to be looked at. And then thermally, what this building has is rigid insulation on the outside, which actually helps to protect the structure for the long term. And environmentally, cellulose is a much better product, and there's cellulose on the inside. This just shows, I'll show a few different details of the exterior wall and some of the efforts of taping of joints that were absolutely critical. If you look at the wooden, we call them outriggers, sticking out from where the roof is, those aren't just joists that are going into the framing below, they're actually sitting outside the air barrier. That's traditionally, when you do outriggers like that, it's very often a place where people try and foam around the joints, but the wood shrinks over it and it moves over time, and there's really absolutely no way you can make that work. So here it is up in the rigid insulation layer, so it does thermally cut down some on the insulation value, but in terms of keeping the air barrier, it does that. So this just shows that the wall assembly sort of blown up, the 2x6 wood frame, the exterior sheathing, the continuous air barrier, so the sheathing and taping of the joints, that then continuously goes up to the roof, so that's what we used for that. Then the polyiso on the outside, which is a foam, but it's one of the less environmentally destructive foams. Building wrap drainage plane, so if water gets through the outside siding, it actually will drain down at that point there. Strapping so that there is a real airspace so that the water can go down, and then the siding, we had different types of siding on it. On the inside, netting to hold the insulation in, and then gypboard in the inside. That actually, I'm not sure what that is, but this shows just some of the attention to detail. This is at the top, you see a concrete footing. You see the wall assembly. Because of the way that it sits at the site, it does make a potentially challenging joint right at where the slab is. It is thinned down, but the air and moisture barriers, or air and vapor barriers, all are continuous. And it's a pretty small area of the insulation not being totally perfect. And this again just looks at some of the window, the care around window details that are really critical inside also. Looking at it from the outside. Again, more on the installation of the windows. Again, showing how the air and moisture barriers are continuous and go up into the window, which then forms the air and moisture barrier at that point. This is the PV up on the roof that will, I think it's like 130 or 40%. They're going to be using it for power elsewhere on the same site. So blower door testing is a big deal. We, in terms of our specifications, have a requirement that it has to, yes?
Sorry, in the previous photo, what were those blocks on the roof between the solar panels?
Blown away.
Got it.
Thank you. So in terms of the blower door testing, we have a requirement that it meets, basically this is the blower door itself, so it's basically blowing air, pressurizing the building, and then you can measure exactly what that pressure is. So Chapman, we said, you have to meet this exact number of air pressure. And we base that on the amount of surface area of the building, and that's actually a part of the contract that we have with contractors. We also are clear that if you do all the measures that we have in the building, you will achieve the goals that we have, and we've done this on multiple projects. To Chapman's credit, I don't think they had ever achieved anything as low as this. They'd done blower door testing. And we also do the blower door testing so that before all of the inside insulation goes on, before the sheetrock goes on, we do the blower door test. So at that point, if it's not meeting it, you just spend a few more hours actually making sure that you tighten up any holes. In the past, many people have waited to do the blower door test until the very end of the project. And if you do it at the very end of the project and you didn't meet it, there's not a whole lot you can do. I mean, you can caulk around the windows and doors a little bit and the baseboard, but you really can't do a whole lot. So we've made sure that the blower door testing happens early in the project. And when you can, both from the inside and the outside, address any kinds of issues. Unfortunately for Chapman, that happened last winter at the absolute worst part of the entire winter. But to their credit, I mean, we actually worked very hard with Chapman to try and figure out ways that we could keep the project moving forward and actually get the blower door accomplished, which did work out. So this was the initial air leakage testing before the building was really there. So you see that's at 0.036, if you'd noticed what our standards, but it's 0.05 was our standard. So at this point, they already had met it. And actually what we want is just to meet the actual number at that point, but they were actually below that. Then so this just shows also the infrared, using infrared cameras, because then you can actually, this is how you can see if there's problems. It'll show up as red, and you can go back and relatively easily fix the problem. The final testing came out at 0.021, and that, for those who know Passive House, this is actually less than half of what Passive House has. You know, many people complain, oh, Passive House is way too hard to meet. This shows that, you know, with care and effort, you can definitely meet Passive House and, in fact, exceed that. And it also shows that, obviously, if you've met it at the partial time when you get to the end, you're clearly going to meet the goal. So this is really one of the lower blower door tests that anybody's done. I mean, I'm sure there are lower than that, but it is a remarkably low number, and that goes to really great care on Chapman's part. So I'd just like to leave you that, one, net zero is fully achievable. There's no technological issues. You know, we can do it today. It's affordable. It's actually less expensive than doing fossil fuels. And you don't suffer it in doing it. In fact, the buildings can be healthier than what typical buildings are. And buildings are about people using them. They're not just about energy and the environment. So making them beautiful also is a part of net zero, and the time is now. It's pretty important that we do that now. So thank you very much. So if there are any questions, I'm glad to take any questions.
So I was struck by your comment. I really liked it, that payback versus cash flow. And in that last little sequence you just showed us, all beautiful, I'm a believer. But I'm definitely struck by that existing building, and your office/apartment was a cool example. I'm just curious if you have other examples, because I feel like in our practice, so much of our work is existing buildings. And I get it that when you're given the opportunity for the new construction, that cash flow analysis I could see it seems easier to me than when you're dealing with that, you know, older building, somebody that's already into their mortgage. How do you handle that?
Great question. It's a lot harder.
Yeah.
And it is doable. From our perspective, it's really about going through the analysis and actually doing the numbers and figuring it out. But we have done a lot of work with existing buildings. Existing buildings obviously are 99.999% of what's out there. If we don't deal with existing buildings, it doesn't matter how many, LEED Platinum, wonderful net zero buildings that are new that we do, we're not going to get there. That being said, it's part of the 2030 challenge. Is looked at, over 20 years, basically buildings do get renovated. So, if you have a 20-year outlook, then there is an opportunity to do something. And the basic thing with renovations is, and trying to get to net zero, is either you do it on the outside or the inside. So the first thing to look at is if the outside's a mess and the siding is a mess, wonderful. It doesn't cost hardly anything more to put the insulation in there. It's the finishes that are really ultimately costing you most of the money. If the outside's not looking so great, very often they're gut rehabs. So like in a gut rehab, again, it's really easy. You just add a little more insulation. That incremental cost is no different than on the new construction. Unfortunately, not a large percentage of existing buildings are that simple in terms of we got to take the outside off or the inside off. But if you do look at that, and if you start your financial accounting saying this is, about we need to take the siding off, it's not a part of the other part of it, then that certainly will help. It does take, building science. It takes creativity. Historic buildings take another level of looking at it. But if you come to that with that intent, and then you go through the same process that we've been doing, you'll find that it's a lot better than you might think. Like in my office, the apartments that were next door. The house wasn't in terrible shape on the inside, but it wasn't in great shape either. And it was rented as one house. And we looked at it and said, it'd actually be a lot better if we made it into 2 apartments because there's a better market for that. That increased our rent. And so then it justified doing a major renovation. Once we had a major renovation, then it justified actually putting in the additional money. It also meant that in terms of pipes freezing, that's the other part of net zero, is that it makes much more resilient buildings. We find that our buildings in Vermont in 30 below weather, if the heat goes off, you may lose 4 or 5 degrees a day, but you don't get frozen pipes. And even very wealthy people in Vermont are afraid of getting frozen pipes in Vermont. I look at my house, which is a very high insulated house. I'm convinced that it would never freeze if I left the whole winter. It wouldn't necessarily be wonderful and habitable, but in terms of that fear, it is gone. So I think you go through the process, and some things work, some things don't work. But I think you'll find if you have if you're willing to take the extra time, and if you allocate things to what's deferred maintenance versus what's the insulation part of it, the numbers and the metrics actually come out better than what you'd think. For instance, the Lincoln School example I have, that's an addition and renovation, and it's mostly renovation. That worked on that project, and the Bennington State Office building. It was a major renovation, but it's not as bad as you might think, but it's not easy.
With such a tight envelope on these net zero buildings, you have a clean air issue, external air coming into the building and internal air leaving. How does that equate into the net zero figure, and what do you do to mitigate the loss of interior heat?
Good question. So fresh air is pretty important in terms of health. You go into most buildings in Vermont, smaller buildings, and they don't have adequate air. There's odor. So we have heat recovery ventilation systems in basically everything we do. So we scientifically figure out how much air should there be for health, and then we make sure it's provided, and we design it in a way that it gets around to that, whether it's a single-family home or whether it's larger buildings. So I think that's critical. I was on a government task force in Vermont probably 15 or 20 years ago, and it looked at the existing new building stock. The building stock in Vermont, not too different than Massachusetts in the 80s, is actually some of the worst housing that's been built. It was reasonably well insulated and tight, and there's moisture buildup. And so those houses in the 80s are rotting. And so when we did the study, I mean, that was one of the things that was looked at, was that already there is actually a problem with code compliant buildings. And yes, it's magnified with net zero, but the problem is there on any new construction and actually on many much existing. One of my sort of favorite examples is people say, well, I don't worry about indoor air quality, I'm in an old farmhouse. And I get a lot of air blowing through the place. And so then with a little bit of glee, I say, well, do you realize what's actually happening? Your farmhouse is built on a stone foundation with usually a lot of water running through the basement. And then you got a lot of holes up in your attic, and temperature stratification doesn't really happen in net zero houses. But in poorly insulated houses, the hot air goes up through the roof. It sucks in the air through the foundation, picking up the mold and mildew that's in the basement and making a perfect machine for delivering mold and mildew to the occupants of the house. I mean, I had one person who was chemically sensitive, and I went to their house in an old farmhouse and said, what can I do? And I said, well, it's fairly simple what's going on here. So that's, it is incredibly important, but what we end up doing is to make sure that scientifically it's done right.
You calculate that in the price of the right?
Yeah.
You're actually calculating the whole thing into the price of the
Yeah.
Have you had much experience with old brick buildings and insulating them, recommending insulation on the inside?
Yes. So as you probably know, I mean, brick, depending on the age of the brick, what the mortar is, if you insulate the wrong way, you will actually destroy all the brick because the freeze-thaw cycle comes into the brick has basically been drying to the interior, and when the brick was originally in the old brick buildings, dried to the interior. And so with the heat actually dried them out, and they didn't get freezing and thawing in the joints and in the mortar. And so when you start to insulate, you change that. And you can basically get freeze-thaw cycles that will then destroy the brick. So with brick, it's actually, you need to actually investigate the mortar and the brick. There's also different densities of brick. And I'm not an expert at doing it, but I mean, the energy people we work with, I mean, are pretty good at being able to identify that without expensive analysis. You can do more expensive analysis to totally determine that. If it's a major, like, historic building, I mean, I definitely would do that. And that analysis is like tens of thousands of dollars. I mean, it's not inexpensive. But you do need to deal with care. And we have, when we've done that, I mean, use cellulose, purposely allowing air and drying potential to the inside of the building and stuff. So, I mean, there are things that you can do, but you do need to. That's definitely a place that you need to think about carefully, because you could definitely do something that would be bad long-term for the building.
I'll just chime in there. We did a project up in Lowell that has a brick exposure. It had a number of different bricks depending on the facade that was on. The alleyway had some cheaper, lower grade brick. And we did one of the analyses that Bill was talking about, and we had to curate our insulation application according to the bricks and the exposure of each side of the building, in order to not create the problems that you were talking about. So it is possible, and it wasn't dramatically expensive.
Yeah, and sometimes it's actually, I mean, you end up having to put less insulation than what we would normally like to see.
Yeah.
So you really need to look at, I mean, you're looking at the dew point and all that kind of stuff. So, you definitely want to change the standards based on preserving the building.
I want to talk a little bit about standby generators for residential and commercial or non-residential buildings. And if your PV generation and storage systems are enough to power those, and if not, what do you rely on for that?
So are you thinking like off the grid?
Anywhere.
Well, so in terms of the question, I mean, so one question that often comes up, can I do a net zero off the grid house in New England? And the energy person that we work with is a person named Andy Shapiro of Energy Balance, who's a fabulous, who's worked on actually all of these projects, and it's been a great part of our team. And we calculated for a single family home how much batteries, because batteries are becoming a big deal in terms of, looking at net zero. And so we calculated for that like 1,500 square foot net zero home in Vermont, where we get cloudy weather like you all do too, The 1,500 square foot house, you probably could do it for $250,000 in batteries, because you're trying to heat the place at the absolute coldest time of the year for 2, maybe even 3 weeks. I mean, it's a huge, huge load. So I don't see how that's happening in terms of off-the-grid housing that's done with with PV and batteries. I mean, obviously, if you have wood as heat, then that really takes care of 90% of the problem, and then the batteries probably can start to come in line if you've really reduced loads. I think where batteries are the next big deal. I think most of us know that if we keep adding solar, and the utilities love to remind us of this, that if we keep adding solar, we may be producing more power than is actually getting used on the grid, and that doesn't work so well for the utilities. In Europe, I mean, they're getting up to like 60% of their electricity, and they're still able to use it because they have a smarter grid than we do. But at some point, there's no argument that you've got to balance. Renewables aren't producing power exactly at the time that we're using them, and that you're going to need some kind of storage. So I think in the building department, what we're going to see is batteries that are basically dealing with the daily fluctuations in solar versus energy consumption and energy production. So I think that's where you'll actually see it, which is the smaller size of battery, which does become more cost effective. I mean, we're actually doing a net zero affordable housing project in New Hampshire, and actually talking to a person who'd been on the public utility board in New Hampshire, who was saying, I mean, that board is beginning to talk about that. So I think we are going to see more of that at a more global level. I think we're going to see more pumped storage and more hydro, which actually it's renewable and can be used for taking care of loads at a larger scale. In terms of generators specifically, I mean, we have used generators. I think one of the things that we feel is a real benefit of the net zero homes to the standards we do, or buildings, is that they aren't going to have freezing pipes. I mean, it doesn't deal with your freezer, but in terms of warmth, you don't have major problems if the power does go out. So I mean, like my house, we have no backup at our house. We have had the power go off for several days. It has been a concern in terms of our freezer, but it hasn't ever been, a major issue. Did I answer your question, or were there pieces that I didn't? Great.
So I want to be cognizant of time, so I don't know if we got one more.
Yeah, if anybody, people can
we'll
take off. If anyone wants a book, I can sell a
We'll
book.
be sticking around a little bit afterwards too, so if there are further questions.
You showed a net zero building with a fireplace. Did you provide makeup air to that fireplace?
Yes. It is a great question. One of the things we've discovered, and I'm hopefully somebody here can prove us wrong, is that nobody really knows about what's going on with fireplaces in terms of how much makeup air you need. We've done tight houses and had it so that you open the window in order to get enough air, and that's still with large amounts of makeup air. I didn't show it here, but we did a lodge up at Mount Moosilauke for Dartmouth College in the White Mountains that has a fireplace that's pretty darn big. And we went through, we hired all kinds of consultants and everything else to actually try and calculate as much as possible. It is possible to give some pretty good calculations, but it's huge, the amount of air that you need if you're trying to do it passively and not actually with a blower. With many of these projects, we've also looked at different ways of how do you really stop the thermal bridging and stuff. Obviously, we tell clients that fireplaces are a problem. But in terms of the makeup air, that is solvable. But you're right. You don't want to go. We started off just so going to a mason saying, "Yeah, we know we need extra stuff. What do you think?" And the mason was like a quarter of what we actually needed. And we tried asking other people, and nobody really. There's not a lot of people who figured it out, but there are some consultants that we actually have talked to and done different calculations. But it's still, there's still an element of dart throwing as far as I can tell. But we have, I mean, we have done fireplaces where there's definitely enough makeup air and they're very tight envelopes. And we find, I mean, if this is like a lodge, I mean, are you going to tell them that they're not going to have a fireplace? But we spent, I don't know how many hours in our office, I mean, actually looking at the thermal detailing of that and the stopping air movement and dampers and all kinds of other stuff.
Thinking about the single-family residence constituency, there are opportunities to have through your utility provider home energy audits, but they don't seem to go nearly far enough. What, from a public education perspective, what would you recommend that municipalities or individual residents do to try to help individual homeowners know what the most cost-effective retrofits might be for their home?
Great question, because we do affordable housing. We work with all different kinds of things, and obviously getting affordable housing that is working well and well insulated is incredibly important. And I think there's a problem because they're putting money into it, which then 5 years from now they're going to go back and do more. So actually one of the earlier questions is about existing buildings. One of the things we've done particularly specifically related to single family homes is what we call strategic energy planning. So basically what we do is with the homeowners we'll say, here's your house, here's what the design would look like to get it to net zero. You're only doing a kitchen right now. Do it to the net zero standards. And over time, in that 20-year period, people are going to upgrade different parts of it. I mean, the old mentality, old thinking was, don't put much more in, do a little better than what the existing house is. It's a waste of money to, do too much. I mean, we found out very early, we do additions, and we'd actually lower the heat load when we did an addition to the building. Use the same boiler, you save the boiler cost because it was so well insulated. So, now our recommendation is to take these standards, even if it's like a bathroom renovation with one little wall, our recommendation is do that wall. It's going to cost you an extra $200 to do it to these standards. And, if you have a plan and you sell a house and somebody's got it, I mean, they can actually do that. So, I mean, I think that's what we ought to be doing with our buildings is saying, here's what we ought to get to, and then here's how we can get the steps there. I mean, I think the weatherization programs have all kinds of challenges in terms of funding, how they, I mean, it's not their fault, and I think they've done a fabulous job. But to me, if we're really going to, ultimately, we need to get the EUIs for every building other than like major historic buildings or whatever. We need to get them down to the same kind of standards. And yeah, there's going to be some which don't, I mean, an existing building isn't going to get quite as low as the other ones, but you can get pretty darn low, and we've done ones that are just as low. So, we need to get the whole building stock to there. And, we aren't getting a net zero planet until we end up doing that. So, that's why we look at it like do a strategic energy plan, then, take off the pieces, the chunks incrementally, because not everybody's got just, the money. They can go and rip off all the outside or rip off all the inside and immediately do it. But if you can't do that, then I think it's sad if people throw up their arms and say, I can't do anything, or I'm not going to put an extra $50 into it. I think what we need to do is to say, no, we have a commitment to making this happen over the long term. We're going to do it little piece by little piece, and eventually we'll get there.
All right, well, in the interest of time, I think I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much, Bill. It was great to have you here. One more round of applause, please.